Jump in. Everyone, welcome. Thank you so much for joining us at this year's second iteration of Medievalists Beyond the Academy, brought to you by the Medieval Academy of America's Graduate Student Committee. I'm Kersti Francis. I'm a graduate student at UCLA, and I'm one of the members of the GSC, and we'll hear more about that in just a minute from my co-host, Beattie. Part of the reason for today's event is kind of really coming from the reality of being a graduate student right now, looking at an academic job market that is, it's never been rigorous, or I mean, never been robust, excuse me, but it is increasingly dire, right? And a lot of us are gaining a lot of really great professional skills that we don't necessarily recognize as such when we are in graduate school, especially if we're thinking or being trained solely for an academy-esque career. So part of what's so important about events like this is that we get a chance to learn from folks who have PhDs in the same kind of fields that we do, medievalist backgrounds, but they're all using those skills in really cool ways that have worked beyond kind of just university research or teaching, which is, of course, very important. But I think a lot of us are kind of looking for what else can we do and how do we get there? So we're really excited to have with us several guests today who are going to share their journeys and how they got here. Just so everyone knows in the audience, and I'll say this again right before we get into each individual speaker, but we will have a really lively Q&A after this. We're keeping our speakers to a 10-minute max of sharing, and then really the focus will be hopefully on a dynamic conversation generated by you guys, the audience. So please feel free during speakers, if you want to throw questions in the Q&A feature or in the chat. My colleague will read them aloud during the Q&A, or if during the Q&A you want to ask a question live, just use the raise hand feature and I'll call on you. So with that said, I'm going to throw it over to Will.
Thanks very much, Kersti. So as you know, this panel has been put together by the Medieval Academy of America's Graduate Student Committee, and I'd just like to take a couple of minutes to tell you a little bit more about the committee and the work we do. So the GSC is made up of about 6 graduate student members from various disciplines, and we all work together to offer a series of services to our global medievalist graduate student community. We have a triannual newsletter that's sent to members of the Medieval Academy. It's got various interviews, articles, and different resources for graduates. We run a mentoring program that's linked to 3 of the major medieval conferences. So that would be the ICMS Kalamazoo, be the IMC in Leeds, and the MAA's annual meeting. The mentoring programs pair graduate students and early career scholars with established faculty or professionals who serve as their mentors throughout the conference and hopefully beyond. And I've been connected with mentors myself through the program and have found it extremely helpful professionally and personally, so I highly encourage you to get involved with it. We run several workshops throughout the year, just like this one. Earlier in the year, we had a podcasting workshop, and we'll have many more plans in the future, so please do keep an eye on your inbox for more information. We also began a podcast series in 2021 called The Multicultural Middle Ages, which I definitely welcome you to check out. We're just starting our 2nd season that launched in February. It's very exciting, and it's just growing and growing. And lastly, we're really active on social media, especially on Twitter and Facebook. And I'll be sharing our social media handles throughout this workshop today. Please do consider giving us a follow. And from our conference panels to professionalization webinars to showcases like today's, or rather workshops like today's, the GSC also carries out other initiatives and programs for the medievalist graduate community. And many of our previous webinars can be found on the MAA's YouTube page. If you have any questions about the GSC, please do feel free to reach out to us at gsc@themedievalacademy.org or email me at wbeattie@nd.edu. And again, we can put some of those contact details in the chat as we go. Thanks very much. Over to you, Kersti.
Great. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it. A lot of folks have just joined since I kind of gave our first introductory spiel. So just to recap, today's discussion will start with individual sharing by our speakers, and then we will move to a live Q&A. Feel free to type questions in the Q&A feature at any time. All right. Our first speaker today is Dr. Casey Morgan. Dr. Morgan earned her PhD in musicology from the University of California, Los Angeles in 2021. Her research combined musicology, sound studies, art history, acoustics, and digital modeling to examine sound and performance at the Notre Dame of Paris at the start of the 13th century. Dr. Morgan currently works as the grants manager for Health Right 360, a behavioral health nonprofit. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Morgan.
Thank you for the introduction, Kersti, and thanks to Kersti and Will for putting this together. So I guess I should start by saying that if you had asked me before I applied and got this job, if I ever imagined myself working in healthcare, the answer would have been absolutely not. It was never on my radar. I hadn't given it a passing thought. But here we are, and honestly, I have no regrets from making the transition. I was on the job market, sort of late 2020 or early 2021, and I know we're all tired of hearing about how COVID impacted the job market, but it was very much a situation that there weren't a lot of tenure track positions. Postdocs, because of that, were going to be even more competitive than they normally were. I just for a lot of personal reasons, made the decision that I was not willing to adjunct for years just to stay on the academic, market. So I almost immediately started applying, on the regular job market, right? I just sort of walked on to listservs with a list of skills that I knew I had and with an idea of what I wanted, out of my work culture and my work environment. And I really just started applying for anything that sort of seemed like it would fit that bill, doing all sorts of fiddling with my resume, applying to anything just to see what would stick and where I would end up. And long story short, right, here I am. I'm now in behavioral health care as the grants manager over at the government grants team. So just brief sort of intro to what that means is that for our organization, because we work based on funding opportunities and contracts from different agencies, right, we have to win contracts from the County of Los Angeles or the state of California or the federal agencies in order to get money to then provide our direct services. So my team is in charge of creating and submitting all the proposals to win those funding opportunities, right? And so a lot of the skills that I use in my job, I actually, got straight out of grad school, right? All those times that you have to put together a lecture series or organize a conference or join a council for whatever reason, even teaching, right? All of that, it just immediately mapped on to what I do now. Right, as the sort of manager over the process, right? I'm in charge of really everything that happens from a funding opportunity coming into my inbox to tracking the notification of award. So yes, a lot of my job is sending emails, it's scheduling meetings, it's making meeting agendas, but it's also the more dynamic process of project management, workflow reevaluation, and working to really improve all those processes that are involved in getting a proposal put together, getting them turned in, and if they're not successful, figuring out what we can do to make them more successful so that we can keep winning money, really. My job is almost entirely remote, so if you have questions about what that's like, happy to answer them. Yeah, that's the shortest version of the spiel I'll ever get, but that's really what it boils down to. And once we get to Q&A, I'm really happy to answer any questions about the job search, about the actual job, being in the nonprofit sphere, or what it was like to make such a dramatic shift from being in musicology to being in healthcare.
Thank you so much for sharing, Dr. Morgan, and I'm sure that our audience will have lots and lots of questions for you in the Q&A. We can move along then to our second speaker, Dr. Becky Strappel-Sovers. Dr. Strappel-Sovers is the marketing specialist for Medieval Institute Publications, the managing editor at Arc Humanities Press, a freelance academic editor, and occasional choreographer and dancer. She completed her PhD on moving bodies in Old English saints' lives at Western Michigan University in 2021. Her research interests include bodies, movement, gender, and sexuality in literature, poetry of the First World War, and the public humanities. Thank you, Dr. Strappel-Sovers.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Great.
Yes, we can.
So my explanation will be a little bit longer, so maybe I can use some of your extra time. So yeah, my name is Becky Strappel-Sovers. I have a PhD from the English department at Western Michigan, which is where Kalamazoo takes place for anybody who's been to Kalamazoo, the International Congress of Medieval Studies. So we're gearing up for May. We're excited to see everybody either back on campus or online this time. Both options are there. I have 3 publishing jobs, so I will try to go through this quick, but I'm very happy to talk more about any of them or answer questions during the Q&A. So I'll tell you what the jobs are first. There's the marketing specialist at Medieval Institute Publications, which is a very small university press located in the Medieval Institute at Western Michigan University. As the marketing specialist, I come up with and execute any marketing we do. So whether that's email, newsletters, social media, conference participation, author events and interviews, anything you can think of that's related to marketing. I also maintain and develop the websites for MIP, the Medieval Institute, and the International Congress on Medieval Studies. And then I do a bunch of admin stuff or just things that need to happen for the press to run, because there are 2 staff members that run the press, along with contractors and usually 1 or 2 student workers or interns, depending on the semester. So we all just kind of do everything that needs to get done. So I also manage peer review and contracts for some of our books. I do some digital rights and file management, and like Casey, a lot of like emailing, databases, data management. I also write our agendas and minutes and things like that. So lots of different stuff. I'm also the managing editor at ArchHumanities Press, and for that job, I basically do contracting for new books and then gatekeeping. So whenever an author submits a manuscript to us to be published, whether it's for peer review or then at actual production, I review the entire manuscript and I work with that author to make sure that it conforms to our style guide, the images are in the right format and, meet all our specs. We have all the rights we need to reproduce images or other content, that the citations are done correctly and that kind of thing. And then I also work with the production team to make sure they understand any sort of complicated production things that need to happen, which with medieval studies, there is often some complicated stuff that needs to happen with editions or scripts, non-Western scripts or things like that. So, and then I'm a freelance editor and I've done that for almost 15 years. For the past 5 years, I specialize in academic writing. So monographs, edited collections, dissertations, theses, articles. But in my career as an editor, I've done everything from memoirs to like how-to books, young adult Christian sci-fi novels, so all different kinds of things. My beginning in publishing was probably actually a little uncommon because I actually do have a degree in publishing studies. There's not a whole lot of degree programs in that field, and you do not need a degree to work in publishing. Most people in publishing don't have a degree in publishing. They have a degree in something else usually. But I was doing a bachelor's degree in English Ed at Illinois State University and realized I did not want to teach high school. And so I saw that they had this publishing degree and I changed partway through. And part of the requirements for that degree was doing an internship. So I worked at a very small publisher in Chicago. And then I got a job at the IT office in my College of Arts and Sciences as a technical writer. And I did some web development there. So I learned HTML and CSS at that job, and then also in a course for the publishing degree. And those were those skills were very useful for finding additional jobs down the road. I also started freelancing toward the end of my bachelor's degree, and my first client was a safety consulting firm that worked with industrial shipping companies. So I've sort of freelanced off and on since then. I found medieval studies toward the end of my bachelor's. So I graduated with the publishing degree, but decided pretty soon after that I wanted to go to grad school for medieval literature. So I got my master's at University of York in the UK, freelanced off and on during my master's, partially for extra money and partially because I wanted to keep that part of my resume current. When I finished my master's, I wasn't sure whether or not I wanted to do a PhD. So I moved back to Chicago, and for about 1.5 years, I worked at a publishing distribution company, which basically represents very, very small publishers. A lot of big retailers don't want to open a vendor account for a publisher that might only have 1 or 2 new books a year. So instead, they opened an account with this group called Independent Publishers Group, and we kind of represent them to these big retailers, and then also started taking over all their like e-commerce and fulfillment. So I did technical writing there, a little bit of marketing, and then more of that web development, kind of designing their storefronts on our website. Then I started my PhD at Western in 2013, and I had kind of a really big lucky break because I don't think I realized when I started at Western that they actually had a university press on campus that specialized in medieval, well, pre-modern studies is what we say now. And so I discovered that sometime in my first year and thought, well, I definitely want to get involved in that somehow. I'm not quite sure what that will look like, but I asked a friend in the Medieval Institute to introduce me to the then director. And I basically just did an informational interview with him, which I'm happy to talk more about those if anyone has questions about that. But kind of asking him about his background in publishing, how he had got there, what MIP did, that kind of thing. And I think the summer after that, they were looking for student workers. So I applied for that job and got a junior editorial assistantship or assistant job. I had a teaching assistantship at the time for my PhD, so I could only work about 5 hours a week on top of that assistantship. But I just did that for the next few years, kind of as long as MIP would let me work for them. I just worked a few hours a week doing a lot of like data entry, admin, just stuff that they needed somebody to do for the press. And eventually when I started that job, MIP was partnered with ArchHumanities Press. In 2017, they actually split and became independent presses. And about that time, I had finished my assistantship. I had run out of funding from the department, but I still had several years of my PhD left, so I needed to make money somehow. So I kept working at MIP, and I started working hourly as like a contractor for ArchHumanities Press as well. And over the next few years, MIP was basically able to give me a few more hours, 10 hours, and then 15 hours a week. And around the time I graduated, they actually created a marketing specialist position. I applied for that. They had never had a devoted marketing. They had never really had anybody doing any marketing for them, actually. So they created this new position, and I applied for that position and got that. And so that's kind of where I'm at now. I work for MIP 30 hours a week, ARC 10 to like 15, depending. And then I kept freelancing during my whole grad student career. I work jobs in where I can as they come up. One of my most consistent clients right now is another medieval publisher, Dallas Medieval Texts. So I do a lot of copy editing of English translations of medieval Latin texts for them. And that's where I'm at. My trajectory at MIP was pretty typical for publishing in that I started at entry level with that junior editorial assistant job and then kind of moved up. A lot of people in publishing will start at entry level, move up or move laterally within the company to some other position. That seems to be really common. As I said, you don't need a publishing degree to work in publishing. What you do need is a lot of stuff that a PhD, certainly in English literature, but really any humanities PhD, especially an interdisciplinary subject like medieval studies, will give you. So that's things like good communication, very, very good writing and editing skills are obviously necessary in publishing. Very strong attention to detail. Kind of no matter what you're doing in publishing, it's not just editing that needs that attention to detail. It really is like all the different jobs. And then sort of like admin related stuff like time management and handling deadlines. Yeah, every job says that they want that, but I think it is really, really necessary in publishing. MIP has 2 staff members and we still publish 15 to 20 books a year. So that's those books are just for this year. Plus we have all the projects that are kind of coming down the road. All of those projects have a long list of deadlines. All of those deadlines are different for all the different projects. You're constantly kind of working on this rolling list of deadlines, all these different projects at once. So you really need to be able to kind of skip back and forth from different projects, keep a handle on all those deadlines. In bigger presses, you'll do fewer different tasks throughout the day than maybe someone like me does, but you need to be able to kind of switch tasks a lot. A lot of university presses are pretty small, so I think a lot of people who work in that environment are doing lots of different jobs. So yeah, a PhD is also not necessary, but especially if you're working for university presses, I think they find a PhD attractive. And it's also helpful to be able to understand academic writing, academia as like a place, and academics as people and how they work and how to communicate with them. So because of the result of doing all these different jobs, I've done almost everything in publishing with a few exceptions. So I'm happy to answer more questions or talk more about any of this. So looking forward to everybody else's presentations and to the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Becky. That was great. You wear many hats and they're all going to be useful to learn about in Q&A. So thank you. It sounds like got a lot going on, like in a really cool way. Our third guest today is Dr. Lucy Hinney. Dr. Hinney completed her PhD at the University of Edinburgh in 2019. Her research interests include late medieval and early modern literature, older Scots poetry, medieval feminist criticism, and the pedagogical potential of the digital humanities. She's an enthusiastic advocate for open knowledge and the use of wiki platforms in academic contexts. Dr. Henney is an associate editor of the Journal of the Northern Renaissance, a member of the TEI by Example International Advisory Committee, and just completed 2 years as the Wikimedian in residence at the British Library. Dr. Henney is also a prolific pop culture podcaster, and you can find her on the Podcastica Network. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks, Kersti. Am I audible?
Absolutely, yes.
Fabulous. Let me know if that changes. Hi, everyone. Just for some context here, I currently live in York in the UK, and it is midnight. So if I'm a little spacey, that's why. But it's lovely to be here. And I'm going to take you through just a little bit about how I got from my studies to where I am now, or as I call it, what's a Wikimedian, or how I navigated from postdoc to open knowledge and still managed to confuse my mother, who I still don't think quite knows what I do. So here we are. Now let's just see if I can switch this slide on. There we go. Okay, so the path here to where I am now, I thought it'd be useful to lay it out here. I did an MA in English and Scottish Literature at Edinburgh, a more specialist MPhil in Scottish Literature at Glasgow, PhD English Literature 2012 to 2019, and then I held a Leverhulme postdoctoral fellowship between 2019 and 2021, which was just an excellent time to hold a fellowship or to be a human, really. And the picture on the right there is me looking a bit dorky in Saskatoon, Saskatchewan, which is where I held my fellowship. I used the funding from the study abroad scheme to move over to Canada. And there were some reasons for that I think will become more relevant as I go on. My PhD, as you can see, it took 7 years to complete, which is really unusual in the UK. In the UK, we really are very much pressured into finishing in 3 years, if you can imagine that. The reason for this long period of doing my PhD is that I did it part-time. Alongside all of my PhD work, I was always working because I was self-funding, which was a really difficult and stressful thing to do, and I don't recommend it to anyone. But I'm not ashamed of these other jobs here at the bottom. This is a concise CV of all the random jobs I've held since I turned 15. So I've been a tutor, I've waxed skis, I've been a tour guide of both Ghost Tour Guides of Edinburgh and Whiskey Tours at Glenfiddich Distillery. I was a warden in the royal household while I was an undergraduate to pay the bills. I was a retail assistant at various terrible shops. I'm a humanist celebrant, so I can marry and bury people, which is something to add to your CV, I suppose. Much like Becky just mentioned, I also worked as a business administrator for a company that did hardcore training courses for businessman negotiation, which was very strange place to be when I was trying to finish my PhD, but very useful. I was also a box office manager, and I was and continue to be a podcaster about things that are just nothing to do with academia, and I kind of like it that way because it keeps my brain a little bit happier, I think. So what I'm doing now is I am a digital skills Wikimedian for Wikimedia UK, which is a knowledge charity and the national chapter of the Worldwide Wikimedia Foundation. I'm currently hold a small postdoctoral fellowship at IASH in Edinburgh, which is 3 days a week, in which I am going to hopefully finish writing my thesis into a book so that I can draw a line under that particular stage of my academic career and, in essence, really say goodbye to that time of my life. And until the start of this month, I was Wikimedian in residence at the British Library. This picture on the right here, this is what I do now. This is me and my colleagues running a hybrid editathon for the National Trust in Queer Britain down in London. On my lunch break, I got to wander downstairs and see the first curated selection of queer artifacts in the UK. And as I think is obvious, I felt really happy. And it struck me actually when I was running over these slides, 2 out of the 3 people in this picture actually have a PhD. On the left is my colleague, Dr. Richard Novell. If any of you are doing anything to do with medieval castles or architecture, you'll come across Richard, who's also now a Wikimedian and also working out of academia. So one of the fears I had, I think, was that if I left academia, I wouldn't find my people again. And it turns out they were all just waiting on the other side of it. So although it can sound scary, it's really something worth doing. In my 2 years at the British Library, I worked with curators, very much academic mindsets. I worked with governance staff, very much civil service mindsets. I worked with amazing collections like the India Office Records, Picture in Canada, comic books, born digital resources, book bindings, and a collection called the Lord Chamberlain's Plays of censored plays from the late 19th and early 20th centuries. I like to think of myself as a Swiss Army knife in the library. I was working with different departments to do different things, and all of these things involved communication, concise and legible reporting, researching, and an inherent ability to turn information over quickly and get a handle on something. That to me is what a Wikimedian is, but a more official description of a Wikimedian is someone who works with an organization to promote open knowledge generally, and specifically to enable more people to engage with Wikimedia, so Wikipedia, Wikidata, Wikicommons. And it was actually my colleague Alice White, who also has a PhD and is also a Wikimedian working with the Wellcome collection in the UK, who came up with that definition. Being a part of Wiki is amazing because there are chapters all over the world. I do a little bit of work with the Wikimedia Foundation, which is, of course, the kind of overarching international body. And that's really cool because I work on a program called Let's Connect, in which we do peer learning with chapters from every continent you can imagine. And that's something that I'm very proud of, and one of my favorite parts of the job because it involves teaching and engaging with people. So how did I get here? The pivot to this career for me was quite organic and actually a tale of failure. I think in academia we don't talk about failure enough, and I think it's something that's actually really pivotal to how I ended up here. In terms of specifically ending up in the role at the British Library, I had interviewed earlier that year for a digital scholarship fellowship at the National Library of Scotland, which I didn't get. But they were impressed with my interview and later recommended that I look at the wiki role at the British Library, which I would never have applied for if someone hadn't suggested it to me. In the meantime, I'd worked with the NLS building a proposal for teaching with wiki in my medieval women seminar in Saskatoon. To me, it was about moving with the times. I wanted to do something open source. I wanted to do something crowdsourced. I wanted to do something that would engage my students from their own homes because we were right in the middle of the pandemic and lockdown. Wikipedia is there, we all use it, and I felt it was time for us to sort of change our attitude towards it. I was following my gut in a lot of the decisions that I've made over the last few years. Sometimes you have to ask yourself, are these the people? Are these the support network that will make me feel seen and happy? And I cannot emphasize enough how important that is. It was a mix of academic and non-academic skills that got me here. And I think all PhDs are united in that we all like learning. And that's a huge asset because a lot of people, they don't like learning. They just want to come in, do their job, go home. The fact that we generally have an enthusiasm for knowing new things is a huge asset. Difficulties I found with transitioning into jobs outside of the academy were the level of being managed, the kind of red tape I would encounter and the way that would impact my ability to do my job. You don't get to be quite as self-directed. The best thing I did, I think, was take every opportunity up to this point by the horns and see what I could do. So when I was a box office manager, I was doing human resources and management training. When I was working in that business job where I was mainly filing, I took the negotiation skills course. I've done training, I've done tutoring. All of these things have added together to give me what I think these key points on this slide are. Research skills, the ability to engage with the public on a level that is not exclusionary and academic, a flexibility. All throughout my PhD, I knew because of my economic background that the chances of me getting an academic job were very slim. And because of that, I developed a resilience and a flexibility that I think has served me really, really well when things got harder for those around me. An interest in cultural heritage. How does your PhD actually relate to the culture around you? And what bits of it interest you that might interest someone else, you know? And that's a huge part of Wiki. Occasionally I do work with a wiki movement called Medieval Women Wiki. It's just a group of PhDs like you, like me, who like to edit things on Wikipedia about medieval women. And it's a great thing to do because it's something that is not really assessed in the same way, and it allows us to share that knowledge with the world in a very free way. critical thinking. You can analyze things, you can write reports in a way that a lot of other people cannot. So that's something to really hold on to. And most of all, hustle. And this is really hard because there are a lot of introverts in academia. In case you can't tell, I'm not an introvert, I'm quite an extrovert, but hustling is hard. One of the things I recommend is if you see a job you like, if you see something you want to do, contact somebody at that organization, speak to them, make yourself known. And it is so naff to talk about, and it's so uncool to be like, put yourself out there, but it really does help. When it came to getting my job at the British Library and interviewing for a couple of jobs before that, I emailed and arranged Zoom meetings with the people who were hiring to explain to them that I was making the pivot from academia. What were they looking for and how I could give them it? And I do think it made a difference because I think it meant I was in their brain when it came to shortlisting. I may not have been there in a good way. As I say, there are a lot of failures on the way to success, but it did also help me conceptualize what they were looking for and how I might fit in. If I could give you a how-to guide, these would be the things I would tell you. Stay open-minded. We all had an idea of what it would be to be an academic and have a PhD, and what you end up doing might not be it. It's important to be flexible and as resilient as you can be. One of my favourite books is a book called Yes Please by Amy Poehler, who you probably all know from Parks and Recreation. She talks about your career being a bad boyfriend, and she tells us it will not love you back. And I think that's a really important thing to bear in mind. Your career is a bad partner. Keep your options open, and remember, you can always, always do a little bit better. Or in many cases, a lot better. Read experiences of other people. This is a really great place to start, coming here and listening to what people are saying today. That is hugely important. A great book is Katina L. Rogers, Putting the Humanities PhD to Work. That actually came out in 2020, and I found it a very helpful read and a very useful seminar to attend in thinking about how to reframe my research. Visualize where you want to work. Speak to the people who are in jobs you want, or stalk them on the internet in a safe and hygienic way where you just look at their LinkedIn profile and figure out what it is they did to get there. And on that note, LinkedIn, yes, I know it's the worst, but it's also a really good place to see the paths people have taken, see where the jobs are coming up, and learn the language to navigate employment. The hardest thing for me was reading job descriptions to figure out what did the titles actually mean. Like, I don't know what that particular jargon word from the business world or from the private sector means. By reading job descriptions, you will find that out and you'll be able to pick it up quite quickly. What I will tell you is that you are wonderful, you are great, you are going to go and do amazing things. You don't need academia to let you do that. But the one thing I would teach you is that the biggest hurdle is learning how to market yourself in that language of other organizations. Visualize where you want to be, and you will end up there, I promise. Just keep doing the, as I say, work of being on LinkedIn, reading job descriptions, and talking to people like us who've come out of this period and are all here to help and support you with that. So with that, I'm going to pause. I'm happy to answer questions about any aspect of any of the weird and wonderful things I've done, including whiskey questions. But I'm happy to pass back to Kersti at this point for our next panelist.
Thank you so much, Dr. Hinney, for that. That was fantastic. I think it's really valuable to bear in mind that all the different jobs we've done, no matter large or small, have sort of shaped our paths professionally and personally. And thinking of ourselves as a Swiss Army knife is a very useful way, I think, of thinking about those skill sets we acquire over the years. We're going to move now to our final speaker, Dr. Joaneath Spicer. Dr. Spicer received her PhD from Yale and is the James A. Murnaghan Curator of European Art from 14 to 1700 at the Walters Art Museum in Boston, after a decade of teaching at the University of Toronto. Her research publications and ongoing projects have stretched from Petrarch, the Limburg brothers, up through a West African prince at the court of Louis XIV in 1700, with concentrations on secular 15th century Italian painting, the African diaspora in early modern Europe, Netherlandish drawings around 1600, and the intersection of art and science within the Chamber of Wonders tradition. Dr. Spicer, thank you. I'm sorry, you're still on mute.
Ah, there, yes.
Perfect.
Yeah, this has been so interesting to hear other people's paths. One thing, just so I don't forget to say it later, to follow on what some of my colleagues here have said. Keep going. You may find that the job market is not exactly the market that you had hoped it would be, but there are many ways. If you really want to be a scholar, rather than take some other path that uses these skills, there's nothing saying that you can't keep doing that. That you can't keep contributing to the field with your publications. Most people in academia have pretty busy schedules, and it's not as if they can spend all their time doing research. So don't let people or anything really get in your way if you really want to do this. But in any case, back to what I do. This guy right behind me, who's kind of watching me, if you can see him better here, is one of the kind of secrets of why I absolutely love being a museum curator, and far better than being an academic. And I would say I am definitely a recovering, or rather recovered, academic for sure. And that is this space. Modeled in gold, is inside a Nautilus shell cup in our collection from around 1600. If you are the visitor, you cannot possibly see this. This is one of those wonderful things. There's no way that we could install that properly so that you could actually see that, but I can see it. And it's fantastic, and I want to publish it for sure in some kind of context. It's the best piece of Dutch sculpture in the entire history of humankind, I would say, or in any case of Dutch humankind. And that's one of the great things about my job, is that you get to have an intimate connection with the materials that you're working on, regardless of the period in time or geographical locations of where you are. Now, I am not actually a medievalist. You might well wonder why I was invited here. I'm not exactly sure. They didn't actually tell me why they invited me. It was maybe because I objected when I saw a description of the last program like this, that there were no museum curators there, which is such an obvious place for art historians who are medievalists. In any case, at the Walters on my floor, until very recently, because of a retirement, there were 3 PhDs in medieval art, as well as a doctoral candidate from Hopkins, who's has a fellowship with us. Now that doesn't count me. I don't have a PhD in medieval studies. Mine was in early modern, and initially worked more in Dutch 17th century art, and have sort of moved back, as many people do, in time or forward. And so I'm actually going to show some slides too. So this is more, oops, now I've got to go backwards. This is supposed to be my last slide. There. Okay. Here's a brief look into our one of our medieval galleries, for which we have a very important collection. You all might well have invited my colleague, Christine Chaka, who's curator of medieval art. She's in the process right now, though, of the final editing of the publication that goes with a very important exhibition on Ethiopian art that she's doing. We have a very large collection of Ethiopian art, which is closely connected historically as well with our various aspects of the Christian tradition in the Eastern Mediterranean. This is, one of her areas, and it's going to be absolutely wonderful. But one of our other PhDs, actually who recently retired, she was one of the various people I know who have had PhDs in medieval art, but decided that actually there were parts of their job that were more thrilling or more than their education that were more interesting than others, and have taken a slightly different path. She was one of the people in charge of our exhibition processes and helped design some medieval installations, etc., but was not a functioning medievalist. Let me, wait a minute, go. My own work sort of ranges, or publications have ranged absolutely from 1400 to 1700. One of the small little splendors in my collection is this pendant here on the left. It is almost surely by one of the Limburg brothers, the one who was actually a goldsmith, but whom we don't have any signed works. On the other hand, our project that I'm involved with now involves a painting on the right, which is of an African prince who came to the court of Louis XIV and commissioned, I'm sure, this portrait of himself as Balthazar. So, it's such a privilege to work with these wonderful objects. Not that students aren't also can be wonderful. I had many good students. I heard from one of them out of the blue this last week, which astonished me, from 45 years ago. What, but in any case, these objects are wonderful, and to have this kind of material that you're working with, and especially in the case of my own work with the African diaspora, which I have been quite dedicated to since starting around 2000, and getting more and more involved with publications of various kinds and installations. It's in a way, it's a form of public humanities. And to take issues that have potentially great scholarly research, or the opportunities for that as part of the build-up to these, but material that can really open people's minds to the past, is, to my mind, a really great privilege. And something that isn't usually available to you as an academic. But in the museum world, the numbers of people who you can open their minds to something in the past. A Baltimore population is 2/3 Black. And that we are able to offer a different view of the past, sort of to normalize their history. I could never do that as an academic. It just wouldn't be possible. But in the museum world, by doing exhibitions, etc., you can offer this kind of personal experience to people, for people, that is, to my mind, absolutely fabulous. I just had closed an exhibition that involved what many will consider late medieval art. The altarpiece that's really in the, can I do this? Middle here, this one right here, is from 1400, Italian 1400, from the east coast of Italy, by an artist, Olivuccio. Not a household name, because he worked on the east coast of Italy, which is less well known, very conservative area, but a fabulous piece. And what I was doing here was introducing works of art by local artists that in one way or the other, it seemed to me, drew on traditions of concern for human concerns that are not limited by time, and that connect these periods together. This is the effect was quite wonderful to see how people responded to these works. Again, something in working with the public, you get a whole range of responses, and it's one of the great opportunities of the discipline. Also, another way, it seems to me, in terms of not to limit yourself, I delve into, or I actually publish also with ancient art, sometimes in medieval, and going on even later in terms of looking for cross currents in the history of art, especially as they have to do with people's experience of art. I mean, that comes, I'm sure, as a curator, that I've been much more concerned with the audience. How do people respond than I probably would have in the past? This little wonderful rock crystal reliquary that's right in the front, which is in this Chamber of Wonders that I initiated, part of a suite of 3 galleries recreating a 17th century style collection. And this piece, which is from the Burgundian traditions of the Dukes of Burgundy, this wonderful rock crystal reliquary from the mid-15th century, is a perfect example of the kind of wonders of human ingenuity, and celebrating that with different cultures. This is now, I'm happy to say, the most popular gallery in the museum. And I think because so many people find that they can kind of connect the dots for themselves there in their own way, and tell their own story here, which is what would have happened in the 17th century. So it gives me a lot of joy. I would say there weren't very moments of joy when I was an academic, particularly. But I would say there are lots of moments of joy in the museum world, either because you discover something totally fantastic yourself, or because you see people discovering something totally fantastic that's fantastic to them. So I'll stop.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Dr. Spicer. That was really cool. And the Wonder Cabinet exhibit that you've done, well, the Wonder Room, I mean, that's
And you have to come.
It's tangible. Yeah, I'm moving to Boston in the fall, so I will definitely have to come by. Exciting.
Where am I? What happened to me?
Oh, you're now in a small screen. You're back on like a small box with the
I
panel.
can't see anybody. Okay, that doesn't matter.
Okay. I'm not sure exactly how to fix it on your end. If you are able to kind of re-click the Zoom application.
There.
Oh, sorry. Yeah, if you wanted to, yeah, end screen share. Perfect. Great.
I'm not a techie, as you can see.
Oh, no problemo. All right. So this now brings us to our Q&A. Thanks so much to Dr. Henney for already getting on some great Q&A in the chat. And actually, one of the things that Lucy brought up in her conversation is something I'd love to ask kind of all of you, which is, how did you, or what was the biggest challenge you found in trying to navigate like from academia to your current role? You know, Lucy, you mentioned kind of the being managed, right? Like that was something new that was, some growing pains, right?
I wonder, so I did my PhD in the UK, but had 2 years in Canada, and I do feel in the UK that we're more hands-off, despite wanting everyone to get finished quick. Like I feel like I should mention the state of affairs in the UK is really bad at the moment. Like there's ongoing strike action, like it's really quite terrible. And it has been since before I finished my PhD. But within that, because we were left very much to our own devices, and because with my postdoc I was lucky to have a supervisor who was very trusting that I knew what I was doing, it was a big struggle to suddenly be in a structured workplace and not be able to just be like, screw this, I'm going for a coffee, just sit and think. Like you have to be like, oh, I have to be at this meeting. It's just rubbish. But thankfully, with remote work, and I think that's something that Becky and Casey, I know it was Casey actually brought up, working remotely. Things are a bit more flexible, and certainly with Wiki now, it works in a very different way to the library, so it's been a bit more accommodating of that difference. But yeah, I there was a bit of me that really pushed back against that. I missed a lot of the kind of ponderous ways that we can work in academia that are a bit more self-driven. But I'm finding ways to incorporate that into my professional life now, I think.
Yeah, they trusted us to work remotely for 2 years during the pandemic, but I guess we can't do that anymore for my position. So I don't really enjoy sitting in an office every day now. That was one of the things I really liked about academia, was that kind of like, you have a lot of control over your own schedule. You can kind of work on things when it makes sense for you to work on them, or you're kind of doing a lot of different things during the day, because you might be teaching a class, but then you're going to do your own stuff, but then you're going to like a committee meeting or something. I like that kind of doing a lot of different things all the time. Now, I do get to do a lot of different tasks during my day, like I said, but I mean, I'm at a desk 6 hours a day, as the case may be, because of my part-time status. But that was a little bit of a weird thing to go back to. I really, having already worked in like a cubicle setting, I really didn't want to go back to an office, but that was, you know, a staff job at the university that's required, unfortunately. So probably just losing a little bit of that like feeling of independence over my own time was kind of a big challenge for me.
Yeah, I would agree. Right? Being stuck to a 9-to-5 schedule or an 8-to-4 schedule, whatever your schedule ends up being, is a little hard. I think for me, actually, the hardest thing to get used to was knowing that I was going to step into a position that suddenly I knew like really nothing about the environment I was entering. So it was like getting really used to sounding kind of stupid at meetings and like having to ask really basic questions of like, I'm sorry, what does the acronym stand for? Over and over and over again until you like settle in.
Am I? Oh no, I can say that the biggest thing when on my first day as a curator, I actually had no idea for sure what curators did day to day. Because I didn't remember actually seeing specifically a job description. So I fell back on what had drawn me to being a curator in the first place. And that is, when I was an academic, I'd done a lot of consulting on the side with collectors and bought for them works of art. So I just started looking at auction catalogs, and I went into my boss's, the chief curator's office, about 2 o'clock on my first day, and said, "Well, I think we need this painting." So in any case, so I sort of eased into it. I would have to say that I work at least a couple of days a week at home. That's frequently the most efficient place for me to work. So I don't. We're quite flexible on that at the Walters. You just have to be doing your job in the best way possible. So I found the idea of something that I found first odd, but then I came to like very much, was the fact that you were so interdependent. In academia, you are not. Most of the time, you are not, unless you are on some working group or something like that. But to make a major exhibition work, it takes a lot of people. And they all have their skills. You don't have their skills. They have their skills. And it takes all these people, and it takes a vast amount of time to get everything organized, whether it's loans, designs, funding, all kinds of things. It's wonderful how you come to, I think, and certainly I felt improved as a human being through this process of feeling much more appreciation for the whole range of jobs that it takes to make something work. And universities have a lot of people doing all kinds of things that it takes, but you don't see them most of the time. You don't work closely with them. Their office isn't 2 doors down from you, and you're kind of isolated. I think found this a very, and the sense of esprit de corps is much stronger, can be in a museum, at least at the Walters, than my memories ever of academia. Not that it was not happy, it was not, congenial. It was just kind of laissez-faire a little bit more. So that was something I had to get used to, but then found really a wonderful thing.
Brilliant, thank you. We have a question in the chat from Saroon who asks, oops, just disappeared, here we go. They ask, is it possible to obtain a career in a library with a PhD and without something like Masters in Library Sciences? And perhaps we can also broaden that out to ask, when it comes to things like publishing, museum curating, how important is it to have a specific degree or qualification in that area?
I can speak to libraries briefly with an informative anecdote, I hope, of something that I forgot to mention, and some brief reflections. One of the things I should have mentioned in my presentation that I didn't, and you've reminded me with that question, is one of the things I did do before I made the decision to leave academia was do a session with a career counsellor. Now, that comes from a position of like, at that point, I was funded and had the money to do that. If there comes a point where you're able to afford that, and it wasn't as expensive as I thought it would be, and I think it was an hour and a half with this career counsellor. It was so useful, and I didn't come out of it being told like, by the way, you should have been a vet and you should have done veterinarian studies and you've really screwed up your whole life. That wasn't what happened, but what it was really good to do was recontextualize outside of the academy with somebody who really doesn't care about like how many journal articles you've written. What are you good at? And what they do is they give you a list of like, what do your answers align most with, like what career? And for me, it was librarian. And I was really angry because no one told me that you needed an M-list to be a librarian. They all told me that if you had a degree in English, you could find yourself in a library doing a library job. The hard truth, I think, is you will not get a traditional librarian job unless you have an M-list. That was my experience in North America. And it's rough, but there are so many good options for how you could do that. But for me, the thought of doing an extra 2 years of study was too much. I couldn't do it. It would have not worked for me. It may work for you though, and I wish you really good luck in that. There are some great programs, particularly in Canada. You can work in a library that has space for curators or outreach people. And for me, the British Library is a national library. So we have over here Wales, Scotland, and England holds the British Library. I could go on about why that's weird. Suffice to say, we have a lot of national libraries here. I'm not sure what the setup is in America or Canada in that sense, but if it's a library that's big enough to have like an education department, you might be able to talk to them there. But if it's a trad job like cataloger or something to do with kind of library science, I think it is hard to do without an MLIS. But that's just me. It's always worth trying, and it's always worth talking to the people who've written the job advert and saying, what are you looking for and how can I get to this point even if I'm not there now? So that's my general thoughts on that, and definitely see a careers counsellor if you think it would be useful, because it was for me. It was really transformative.
If we want to go to other fields, I mean, I mentioned a few times in my presentation that you do not need a publishing degree to work in publishing, and very few people in publishing have that degree because there are very few institutions that offer them. There are degrees in publishing, and there are like certificate programs that you can do, so you wouldn't even have to do, if you did want like a more formal educational background, you don't have to do a whole degree. There are places where you can get certificates online, degree education programs as well. I know like University of Chicago has a really well-known copy editing certificate, but you know, these are all expensive too, and most of them don't have funding really that's available, so it's additional expense. And and you don't need them. It's really sort of like an apprenticeship based field almost, where you just start entry level, and like I said, kind of work your way up, learn the job from other people in the company as you move around. So no, you don't need a degree for publishing. There are certainly options where you could get something, but it's not necessary.
I just wanted to say in a similar vein, many institutions are becoming much more concerned about their archives and treating them as a collection area for all kinds of reasons. Sometimes in the US, in museums in the US, and I think also in Canada and England, provenance is becoming a very important issue. How do we, not only of objects, but also of people, you might say, such as your founders, if there is such a, if your institution has a specific founders. And all these things take someone with a keen capacity for historical research. So I know that our archivist at the Walters, who is also our librarian, but that's become very important for the institution, and it's an area that I would encourage people to consider, because it can be fascinating. You're doing something positive for your community, that's for sure. And those it's part of sort of public humanities in a way, and I can't overstate the satisfactions of feeling that as an art historian or whatever specific area of historical studies you may be doing, that you're also somehow contributing to the well-being of the larger community. So I feel very strongly about that, and very lucky that I kind of happened on this.
That's a great point. I think that for me, just speaking for me, sometimes working in academia, I'm worried about like how much am I impacting my community, right? Like how much am I impacting beyond like just my class, which again, important. Classroom impact is huge, but like there's also, you know, a larger community out there that you'll never see in your classrooms that you want to make a difference in as well. I see that we also have a question in the chat. Okay, and then we have one in the Q&A after that. So we'll go, the question in the chat we'll ask live, then I'll ask my question live, and then we'll turn to Sylvia's in the Q&A. Thanks. Perfect.
So Lorraine is asking, what advice would you give to people starting on LinkedIn for marketing and connecting? They say they have a lot of work experience in a field they'd like to transition out of. And just for context, they are also a part-time, largely self-funded doctoral student in an area not connected to their present job. And they say that they feel lost about how to even start their page and position themselves. So do you have any advice for them?
This seems especially apt for maybe Becky, thinking about marketing specifically, since they were interested in that.
Yeah, I mean, I can definitely start. I haven't thought about my LinkedIn in a little while, just because I've been unstable. I haven't been looking for employment. I keep it open, and I have the little open to work thing on my profile because I am still looking for freelance jobs as they come up. But I thought about this a lot partway through my PhD. In 2017, maybe, I took part in a fellowship program called Humanities Without Walls, which I don't know if anybody's familiar with that, but it's a program run by this consortium of universities in the United States, and they have a specific fellowship program, I think every summer still, where it's, I don't remember what it's called now, but if you just look up Humanities Without Walls PhD fellowship, you should probably find it. And it's specifically to kind of imagine what humanities scholars can do beyond the academy. So we're doing this from like a medievalist perspective, and they're doing it from just humanities broadly. And so I was a fellow in like 2017, and we did all of these. It was like a four-week long program. I highly recommend it. I found it very useful. And also, I don't know the current stats, but it came with a pretty nice stipend when I did it. So if you look for summer funding, it can be pretty useful. anyway, one of the things we did was there was, I think, like a whole week about kind of how do you rebrand yourself, because a lot of the conversation around how do you move out of the academy does often come down to like, what do I do with the fact that I have a PhD that's like all this content knowledge that I might not use in a future job. And it is frustrating to feel like you have all that content knowledge you're not going to use, but you need to learn how to lead with like the skills you got from your PhD instead of the content. We're so used to thinking about like that one corner of medieval England that we specialize in or something. But I think a good way to kind of start is to think about, you say you want to transition out of this field. Do you have ideas about where you want to transition to? Because you need to look at, I think as Lucy was saying, like look at job ads, see what kind of language people are using. Casey talked a little bit about language too. What kind of skills are they looking for? And more importantly, how do they express that? Because it might be that like different fields are looking for similar skills, but they might talk about them in a slightly different way. And you want to try to mirror that language as much as you can. If you're really not sure where you want to go, then I would say focus on the skills you have and kind of a bigger idea about the kind of work you do, separated from like the specific content. So when I redesigned my LinkedIn as a result of this fellowship, I have under my name editor, medievalist, educator. And so I broadened it out to be a bigger idea about like editing and educating. I wasn't sure where I was going. I didn't know if I was going to apply to university jobs or publishing jobs. So I really focused on like what I could bring to potential employers that was sort of divorced from the content knowledge that I had. So I think if you have a good idea of what field you want to transition to, really focus on what they're looking for, the language they use, and then try to think about how can you like recast or describe your current skills to make it look like you're satisfying, not make it look like, but to help them understand that you are satisfying what they're looking for. And so it might be less about talking about specific jobs that you're looking for on LinkedIn or talking about specific tasks you've done, instead thinking about the skills that you can bring to them. I don't know. I got a little muddled at the end, but I hope it makes sense.
Absolutely. Any other thoughts, Casey?
Yeah, I'll just throw out there, I was just like a little chaos agent for my entire job search experience. I really genuinely only made a LinkedIn because people expect you to have a LinkedIn. And then I realized as I was applying for things, it's a really good way to like really investigate whoever you're applying to without like making it super public, right? How many people are connected to them on LinkedIn? How long were they there, right? If you're finding a lot of people coming up to an organization or a corporation and they were all there for less than a year, like that's a little bit of a red flag. So you can do, right, like some work environment analysis on LinkedIn. I have had people use it as like a genuine networking tool. All of the people who have done that for me have been in nonprofits, which is just because that's where I ended up in. But so let's just say you can use LinkedIn as much or as little as you want to, and it will be okay one way or another.
Agree more with Casey. And yeah, I would say follow. I'm not a great believer in like vision boards or manifesting, but on LinkedIn, find people who have the jobs you want and look at what they've done. It's really reassuring sometimes to see that they weren't just like snapped their fingers and were immediately in that role. It's good to look and see, okay, so they actually did like German studies and they're now doing this for Oxford University Press, or they did like biological sciences and now they're working for this. So it's really interesting. You can follow organizations as well, I think. Yeah, I would say it's a good tool, and I hate that it's a good tool. I'm the same as Casey, and I think Becky. You know, you it's very against all the things that we're taught in academia about kind of like genuine scholarship and things, and you have to go and market yourself. It's like, oh, but it gets easier, and yeah, look at people's profiles and emulate what they do, and you'll fake it till you make it, essentially.
So I have a question that I will ask live. And my question is for Casey. Casey, this last question kind of reminded me of it a bit, because I know a lot of us are graduate students who spend a lot of time applying for funding, and we're spending a lot of time, putting together applications. And it seems like, or did you find that experience like helpful to get your current position? Like, how were you able to leverage what seems like a really paperwork, maybe chore part of something that we all do into kind of this cool professional opportunity?
Absolutely right. It was a really big sell while applying to anything labeled grants, that you have experience applying for things that can be construed as grants. So like the more variety of funding sources you've applied for, really, like the better off you are. But yeah, right. Like all of the skills of being able to read what they're at, read generally who they're looking for to apply to something, figuring out how to market yourself, and like, here's what I do that's going to apply to what you're asking for, right? And here's how I'm going to get there, right? That like step-by-step breakdown will apply pretty directly. And like, you know, healthcare, it's healthcare, so the grants look very different. But yes, like all those skills were immediately marketable. Grants is a really huge world, right? You can find a grants manager or a contract manager in any aspect of anything where like funding is given to someone else. Like anyone who gives out scholarships or fellowships or research positions, they all have some sort of grants manager or fellowship manager or contract manager, like over all of those. Like it's a really broad field.
And so would you say in your role as grants manager, are you the one like writing the grants, or are you also talk about project management? And I know that seems like a kind of an amorphous, like, what does that mean, project management? You know, could you maybe speak to that?
Yeah. Okay. So I don't do a lot of writing, right? I have a team of 3 writers that like that is their specialty. They've all been at HealthRight for a lot longer than I have. They've all been through, you know, some sort of like junior to grant writer to senior trajectory to learn how to grant write effectively. My job is really to break down like, okay, this is the day we got approval to apply for this. It's due on this day. I have 1 writer. We have to get 400 pages of stuff put together. When does that need to be done by? How are we going to do it? Who's doing what? Do we need more than 1 writer? What is my role going to be? I have to do all the forms. I have to get all the forms, like all the information from XYZ departments. So it's project management in a really informal way, because you can go out and get a project management certificate, right? There are very formal processes for that if you are interested in that, and a lot of companies will enjoy seeing that on your CV and on your resume. It's not totally necessary, right? You can learn your way into project management really, but the general knowledge process of like the PhD process really prepares you for that, knowing like you're going to have to set your own internal deadlines. This thing that looks really unmanageable has to become a manageable task very quickly. You just got to dive in.
Awesome. Thank you so much. I know that we have a question in Q&A from Sylvia, and then we have another one in the chat from Melinda. So
yes,
Will,
we do.
want to go?
Absolutely, we do indeed. So Sylvia has a question for Dr. Spicer. They ask, is there a Wheeler Mellon Fellowship Program for the Medieval Manuscript Department?
We have various fellowships. We're just sort of redoing our fellowship program at the moment. So I would say stay tuned. We have an ongoing relationship with Hopkins, and our present PhD candidate who is working with our manuscript curator is from Hopkins. But we have other postdoc fellowships, and one of them is now, we have one now working in with our curator of Ancient Americas. And we have somebody else working on the history of the Walters, because we want to spend more explicit time on the background of our founders. Bad or good. They developed their businesses right during the Civil War here in Maryland. So there are lots of ways to trip at that time, what one might say. But so the fellowship that is ongoing for sure is connected with the manuscript department. So most of the time, that person is a medievalist. They could be actually probably in Renaissance or something a little bit later, because we have a lot of Renaissance manuscripts as well. One person who had that position some time ago is Griffith Mann, who is now head of the whole medieval department at the Met. So that's where he got to start. So it's a good place to start.
Yeah, and I'll just say as a plug, Baltimore is a cool city. There's a lot of cool stuff there. I don't know, I've been to Baltimore many times. I'm just like, it seems like there's a lot going on in terms of not just academics, but like
Baltimore is, of course, a sort of center of the intellectual world. Not that everybody would recognize that, but it is quite handy that we're so close to Washington. A lot of people live in Baltimore and commute to Washington. And easy to go to New York or Philadelphia, but you don't have to live in one of these bigger cities. So it's a great place to be. And the rare book libraries, etc. at Hopkins are really very good too, with different emphasis than what we have. So yeah, it's a good place.
Excellent. Well, Will, I know we have another one in the chat. I'll throw it to you.
Yeah, absolutely. So this is a question more about, I suppose, the lingo, how we define ourselves as we move in different sort of circles. They're asking, do you market yourself as a pre-modern studies or a medieval studies or an early modern studies in the case of Dr. Spicer? Yeah, what's the lingo in the business world compared to academia?
I only at the end got that was for me. So maybe you better start that question over.
Oh, sorry. Yes. Well, it's for all the panelists, but I was just saying in your case, it's less of a matter of moving from medievalist to something else, but in your case, it's an early modern studies.
Yes, yes.
But so the question more generally again is, how do we market ourselves? If we're not, do we use language like medievalist or pre-modern studies, or do we use something else?
I can go first. No, right? It depends on what you're applying to, whether you need to be academic adjacent, whether like that specialty is going to come in handy, right? I very much marketed myself as a person who had a PhD, who had done some teaching, but was also good at things like event coordination, meeting management, Microsoft Teams, project management, right? So whatever, they'll have a list of skills in the job description of what they're looking for. And so your job is really just to take that, put it in a resume, and then map what things you've done that would directly relate to that. So like event coordination, I planned a conference, I put together a lecture series, that counts as event coordination. Like project management, I did a PhD, I've taught a lot of classes, I've got people to turn things in on time to me.
But
I'll leave it there and I'll turn it over to others.
Well, sorry, but in your cover letter, just to clarify, so you weren't like, I'm a medievalist looking to do XYZ, or I received my PhD in, you know, pre-modern studies or whatever. You were like, I am a person, you know?
Yeah, it was very much, you know, I'm excited about this job. Let me tell you about what I can do. I don't, oh, sorry, go ahead.
I was just going to say, the key thing here is, if you have gotten a successful and done a successful PhD, I certainly hope that you're good at critical thinking. Or if you're not, what was your advisor doing? But to my mind, it's the experience of really trying to mash together a large amount of previously unprocessed material and do it in such a way that you come out with a clear argument. And that is a skill that goes across a lot of different jobs, actually. Just as, you know, as Kersti was explaining, I think it's a critical thinking, is that you market yourself as someone who has gone through a lot of training in critical thinking.
Depending on like the publisher I would apply for, I would probably most of the time just say I had a PhD in English literature. And then if they asked about it, I could talk more about what I specialized in. But like most of them aren't going to care what your content knowledge is. It's the fact that it's a PhD in English literature means I'm probably good at writing and editing and language. And so that made sense for publishing. For the Medieval Institute publications job, they did want somebody with a medievalist background. So I did talk about that. And I did market myself that way. But yeah, it does depend on what the job is that you're looking for. Probably most jobs outside of the academy aren't really going to care what your content was. And they're just worried about what your skills are. And the pre-modern thing, like I said that maybe once or twice in my spiel, that's what, I mean, MIP talks about being focusing on pre-modern studies largely because, and that term is like debated. Some people really don't like it. But we do publish some late antiquity, a lot of medieval, and then a growing number of early modern studies. And so it's easy for us, again, in a marketing way, to say that we publish pre-modern studies, but I do know that it is not everybody's favorite term in the world.
I think it's
But medievalist also, I mean, just to be totally frank, in the wider world, it can turn off people. It sounds like if you say you're a medievalist, it sounds like you only think, to many people, I'm not saying this is true at all. I mean, I separate myself from this, but there are a lot of people who think of medieval as being like the Dark Ages intellectually, and that you're very small, small and compact and interwoven in your thinking, and you can't think broadly. So to my mind, it's just a little bit of an outsider. I would say that pre-modern sounds, they may not know what it means, but it doesn't suggest narrow-minded.
And I think there's a lot of, oh yeah, absolutely. I think there's a lot of conversations kind of surrounding that happening in our field right now that I think that your comment really speaks to. Lucy, I know you were about to say something.
Yeah, I was just going to say, this is maybe on an emotional level, one of the hardest bits about moving away from academia is suddenly the stuff that you've held so close to your heart and defined yourself by, people start not to care. And it's a really weird transition to go through. I remember when I first started at the library, there were certain aspects of my CV that I flattened or was asked to flatten just because it wasn't relevant to what I was doing there. And that really stung. But it was about what I wanted to put forward, what I wanted to put ahead of what I was doing, and that was more the digital side of things. And like you say, Becky, literature. I can do literature, and I know what books are. Like I know what different kinds of texts are. And it's difficult. I think it really is difficult. But I think it was Becky or Casey said, abstract what you do. Don't think so much about which period and which granular detail you're doing, and think more, okay, I have a lit PhD, what does that mean? I have a history PhD, what does that mean? Someone once described to me that a PhD is learning so much more about so much less. Like we become these huge specialists in one very small thing, and it takes a lot for us to see how we know that and the ways of knowing that we then have. So it's quite interesting, I think, to divide yourself that. But yeah, it's a process.
Thank you so much. Lucy, your comment coupled with Casey's bio that I gave, kind of reminded me of another question. Both of you do work in, or have done work in, digital humanities. And that seems like something, as a current graduate student, that's something that like I know a little bit about, and there seems like there's a lot of opportunities for graduate students to like get more involved in the digital humanities. Would you say that's something that you found, like, what did you take advantage of while you were a graduate student that you felt like gave you skills that were then translatable to kind of doing more DH projects? Or Casey, in your case, like, did you feel like that your DH experience maybe gave you leverage to talk about, right, your more advanced technical skills versus, I don't know, or maybe someone who hadn't done those skills?
Yeah, I pivoted to digital in my postdoc more than in my PhD, just because my supervisor for my PhD wasn't very digital. But I made moves in my PhD. I did a couple of full-day workshops and things that were about DH, and I could kind of see which way the wind was blowing in terms of it being a potentially lucrative way to market myself as being able to do something a little bit different. When I was a postdoc, one of the best things I did was go to DHSI in Victoria, British Columbia. If you get a chance to go, it's the best. I loved it. I think about it with really rose-tinted glasses because it was one of the last things I did before the pandemic. So I'm like, it was the best time in my life. It was probably, I would say, like a relatively good conference. But you go for a couple of weeks and you do 2 intense week-long courses in something like TEI or using Python or something like that. There is a lot of hustle and a lot of learning things on the fly, accepting that you're never going to know every single thing, but bigging up what you can do. And one of the interesting things you can do when you interview for non-academic jobs, ask for feedback even when you don't get it. One of the interesting pieces of feedback I got from my library job was that I'd been up against somebody with all the digital skills. Like they like invented Wikipedia or something. I mean, they didn't invent Wikipedia, like close to it. And they were like, but we were actually looking for someone who could train people. And one of the most useful things I learned in HR training was hire for attitude, train for skill. So if it's feasible that you can learn something quickly, go for it. If there's something like my partner, when we were in Canada, a job description said must have access to a vehicle. And at that point we didn't have a car. I'm like, apply anyway. Tell them you'll buy a car. Like, do things like that. Like, don't discount yourself on little criteria. And with DH, a lot of that is being like, I've done these 3 courses, I'm willing to learn more. And that's what I certainly found. I don't know if, Casey, that was the same for you, or if you had a more kind of direct route in.
So yes, I did have like a more direct route in, and that like my dissertation relied very heavily on my digital humanities skills, right? Like half of my dissertation is, hey, I built this digital model. Let me tell you what came out of it. But I do have to say though, like for me, digital humanities was things that I got into, A, because I found it really interesting, but B, because I thought it would really pay off on the academic market. And that would have been true had I stayed on it. And if I had stayed adjacent, that would be true. But as I started looking at non-academic jobs, right, I'm not a coder. I don't want to be a coder. I don't want to analyze market data professionally, which is what a lot of like the DH skills they wanted me to learn in grad school would have tracked to. But I do absolutely agree that like digital humanities teaches you to be really flexible and to learn how to learn a lot of different varieties of skills very quickly. So once you get into that mindset, that's really helpful. And I have to say that the information and like data literacy that you learn in digital humanities, like the different levels of metadata that exist, how they can work together, that's really paid off actually, even as a grants manager. Yeah. So that's been really helpful. But I have to say that like if you're 1 year from graduating and you're thinking like, oh, digital humanities could save me, it won't. Don't do that to yourself. It's like a full 2 extra years to get that certificate or whatever. Like, it's not worth it.
The other thing I would say that's useful about DH, it's a good stepping stone into world outside the academy because it's all about sharing code, sharing things that you do. Nothing is hidden behind a glass door or an ivory tower. It's all like, here's what we can do to collaborate together. And that's a really nice place to be after so long of being like, keep your ideas to yourself or someone will plagiarize them. So it's a nice kind of shift. And I think, yeah, for Casey and I, probably it was helpful to not feel so kind of tightly bound to things and be able to go out and sort of share more openly. Yeah, that's just something to kind of think about, I think.
Well, thank you. I think that takes us to time. Wonderful. Thank you everyone so much for joining us and for sharing your questions. To our guests for joining us, thank you so much for sharing your help and your experience. It's been just so great to learn from all of you. I've gotten a lot of new things I'm going to be processing over the next few days and weeks. For everyone else, don't forget you can connect with the GSC via Twitter or Facebook or our MAA listserv. We'll just drop it in the chat again. And if you'll be at Kalamazoo this spring, well, first of all, we'll all say hi to Becky there. And second of all, we'll keep an eye out for our graduate student mixer that we're hosting. We're also doing 2 workshops based on preparing for the non-academic job market. So one's kind of like, how do you start that search? And the second one is, okay, what do you do with your documents? Like, how do you get a resume finalized? So keep an eye out for that and for anything else that we have geared up in the future. Thank you.